Good afternoon, everyone. My name is KK, and I wanted to thank everyone for coming to today's presentation. Today, my presentation is going to be focused on varieties of offender and their decision making. So there's research that kind of explains why individuals in the correction system make the decisions that they do. There's reasons for everything. So there's a lot of also misconceptions about offender decision making. One common misconception is that individuals commit crimes simply because they're desperate or because they just simply do not think or care about the consequences, which is not always the case. There's research that shows that this is not accurate, at least most of the time. There is the examples of, poverty, trauma, and hardship, which do play a vital role in this, but that's just simply not always the case. And individuals that are living in poverty do not commit serious crimes most of the time. Serious offending is usually concentrated among a small group of people or individuals who have repeatedly engaged in criminal activities and have a pattern of criminal behavior. So that's something important to note. But there's research that shows that offenders do make decisions, and their decisions are shaped by emotional reactions, perceived risks, reward, peer pressure and peer influence, and their cognitive biases, as well as the environment that they're in. So their decision making is pretty complex, and it's really influenced by rational thinking and emotional response to what's going on around them. So to dive back into today's presentation, I'm going to discuss several key research studies that explain offenders' decision making. There's a lot of scholarly research done about this, but for today, I'm going to be using Barnum and Solomon, Apel, Clark, and Cornish, Pogarski, Thomas and Herman, and Hume, and they have also different colleagues. And these studies that they have done can kind of help explain how offenders think, perceive risk, and what kind of influences their behaviors. So there's tons of scholarly research out there, but this is just, some of them. So the first point I want to get at is the dual process model of decision making, and this is by Van Gelder. So Van Gelder explains that decision making involves two cognitive systems. The first one is going to be fast, emotional, and automatic. The second system is slower, rational, and deliberate. So this would be criminal behavior often occurring when the fast emotional system is taking control. So this can happen in situations that involve anger, stress, peer pressure, and opportunity. So in these situations, the emotional reactions are overriding any type of rational thinking. So to give an example of this, we have an individual who may understand that committing assault could result in an arrest and incarceration, but if they feel disrespected and provoked, their emotional system is going to take over and they're going to react impulsively. So Van Gelder's research shows that offender decision making is not purely rational or purely irrational. It depends on which cognitive system is active at that time. So this is also really important because it shows that punishment alone cannot prevent crime, especially if there's an emotional trigger that overrides rational thinking. So that's an important part. So next we're going to talk about emotional influences on violence, and this is Barnum and Solomon. So Barnum and Solomon studied the role of emotions in violent decision making. The research shows that emotions like anger and fear also play a major role in whether individuals will commit violent crimes. So this can be an anger increase, and that goes to violent intentions because individuals are more likely to interpret situations as threatening or disrespectful. And then we have fear, which can also influence someone's behavior depending on whether the individual feels like they are in or out of control. This research kind of challenges the assumption that individuals always are careful and calculate their risks before committing violence. Instead, emotional reactions often shape an offender's behavior. For an example, when someone's in an argument, they may react violently due to anger, even though they know that there's real legal consequences involved, which is super important. So their study shows that emotional regulations play a critical role in offender decision making, which is super important. So next we're going to talk about perceptions of risk and deterrence, which is by Apel. So Apel found that there's perceived certainty of punishment, which is more important than the severity of punishment. So basically, this means that individuals are more likely to avoid crime if they believe they will be caught, rather than simply knowing that the punishment is severe. So to give an example of this, if someone sees others commit crimes without being caught, they might believe that the risk of arrest is low for them to commit that same crime, which increases the likelihood that they will commit that crime and offend. So this research is going to show that increasing punishment of severity alone is not effective if people do not think that they're going to get caught. So instead, visible and consistent law enforcement and laws with punishment is going to be more effective in preventing crime, which is super important. Next is something that a lot of people have knowledge about, and it's kind of controversial, but it's the rational choice theory by Clark and Cornish. So Clark and Cornish developed rational choice theory, which explains how offenders weigh risk and reward when they're making decisions. So their research shows that offenders do consider potential benefits, risks, and opportunities when deciding whether they're going to commit a crime or not. However, offenders do not necessarily stop committing crime just because the risk increases. So instead, they may adapt to whatever crime they're thinking about committing and choose different targets or different methods. So an example of this could be if police had increased surveillance in a high crime area, an offender might move to another area that's less surveillance to hope that they can commit the crime they were wanting to commit without getting caught. So this just doesn't stop them from offending. They kind of just switch tactics. So this study is going to show that offender decision making is influenced by environmental condition and also opportunity, which is super important. So then we have my next point, which is behavioral economics and present bias. So this is by Bogarsky, Roche, and Pickett. So they studied how behavioral economics turned to offender decision making. So their research found that offenders often display present bias, meaning they prioritize that immediate reward over future consequences. So this all kind of ties in together, but an example is an individual may commit a theft to obtain quick money, even though they know that they can get arrested later for this. Their research also found that offenders are often really confident in their ability to avoid getting caught. So they may commit the crime thinking, yeah, I'm not going to get caught. But this also just goes back to the point that it shows offenders do not always make rational decisions, and their cognitive bias really influences their behavior. Another thing that ties into that is peer influence, and there was a study done by Hoban and Thomas. They studied the role of peer influence in offender decision making. So they had some research that found that peers strongly influence one's criminal behavior. So being around peers increases someone wanting to take a risk, looking cool, and it also reduces the fear of punishment. So to give an example of this, an individual may feel more confident in committing a crime in groups because now the responsibility is shared between other people who may be involved in that crime, and they may want to look cool in front of their peers, so that risk is going to go up. So peer influence is increased, and it could also increase the perceived view of offenders looking at their rewards of crime, and decreases the risk of getting caught. So their study kind of shows that crime is a social activity and it can be influenced by group dynamics. So when we're thinking about that, we also have to think about morals. So there was a study done by Herman and Bogarsky. So they studied how one's moral beliefs influence offenders and their decision making. So they found that people with strong moral beliefs against crime are less likely to offend, even if they're unsure of if they're going to get caught or not, whether they feel confident or not about punishment. So individuals with weaker moral beliefs are more likely to look at the perceived risk of punishment. So this is going to show us that internal morals do play a big role in behavior. So kind of tying into that, we have to think about like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, substance abuse. So by Hume, Austin, and Franklin, there was a study about alcohol and emotional arousal. They studied the effects of that on offender decision making. Their research found that alcohol reduces self-control and increases a focus on immediate rewards. So an individual that's under the influence of alcohol is more likely to commit a violent or impulsive act. This shows that situational factors like intoxication weaken rational decision making. So I know I threw a lot of information out there, but we really just want to show that offender decision making is really complex and influenced by emotional, cognitive, social, and environmental factors. So there's research by Van Gelder that shows that emotional thinking overrides rational thinking. The research done by Barnum and Solomon shows that emotions like anger influence violence behavior. There's research by Apel that shows that perceived certainty of punishment is more important than punishment severity. Research by Clark and Cornish shows that offenders adapt to their environmental conditions. Research by Pogarsky and his other two colleagues show that offenders prioritize that immediate reward system. Research by Hoban and Thomas show that peer influence plays a major role. And then there's research by Herman and Pogarsky that shows that moral beliefs influence behavior. And then there's research by Hume and his colleagues that show that alcohol weakens decision making. So all of these findings collectively show that effective correctional policy should focus on increasing certainty of punishment, reducing opportunities for crime, and addressing emotional and social influences and helping individuals develop better decision-making skills. Understanding offender decision-making is critical when we're looking to reduce reoffending and improve the correctional outcome and reduce crime, which is super important. I wanted to thank everyone for being here today and also give a chance to ask some questions, or if there's any rebuttals, I know there will be, just to kind of explain anyone's thought processes or any questions that anyone has. So now that there's been a few minutes to kind of go over the notes that everyone had taken about this topic, because it is a lot of information, there was a few people that had some different rebuttals, and I wanted to kind of go over that. So a few people were arguing that offenders committing crime only because they are poor shows that most people living in poverty do not commit serious crimes. So I wanted to kind of go over that and say that decision making is influenced by emotional, social, and psychological factors, not just like a financial need. So there's more that goes into it than just being in poor or being in a, high crime area or whatnot. There's many factors that go into it. Someone had argued that harsher punishment will stop crime, and well, I somewhat agree to this. We also have to look at the research. So the research, even in this by Apel, shows that perceived certainty of punishment is more important than the severity, because you're always going to have those people that think, oh, I'm not going to get caught, and there is people that don't get caught. So we need to be consistent all around the board. It can't just be harsher punishments. We need to be harsher in our policing, in our stride to get access within communities and talking to people, helping them grow their decision-making skills. We need to have consistency everywhere to truly stop crime, not just when it comes to punishment. Another person had argued that offenders do not think about their decisions, and the research by Clark and Cornish shows that offenders do actually weigh their risks and reward systems, but their decisions are really influenced by whatever cognitive bias and emotions they have at the time. So that's going to be different across the board. Someone else had argued that offenders cannot change, and there is research to show that behavior it's going to respond to like their environment, their conditions, their peers, and their perceived risks. So it really depends on the person. I wanted to ask leadership that is higher above me, I wanted to ask, based on all of this research that I've presented, how can correctional agencies increase offenders' perception of certainty of punishment rather than simply increasing the punishment severity? So part of that is obviously going into communities and helping people learn about their decision-making skills and having consistency across the board. but that's still a very good question to have in mind. Another question I have is, how can correctional programs help offenders improve emotional regulation and decision-making skills? Again, that's going to be consistency in all prisons and jails. There is some that do have wonderful programming, but not enough, and definitely not enough upon release. So lastly, how can agencies reduce the negative influence of peer groups on offender behavior? And I think that that's something that I'm also going to keep in mind. So I really wanted to thank everyone for coming today and talking about this. This is a very important topic when we're looking at the correctional system and offenders, because they do have decision-making skills, and oftentimes they do kind of weigh their pros and cons when they're thinking about committing a crime. It's not just because they were poor or in a bad area. There's many different reasons why people do the things they do. So this is very important when we're trying to understand crime and look to make change in the justice system. So I appreciate everyone coming today, and I hope everyone has a great week.